Hello, welcome to our final instalment of our 2020 Top 50 Young Gun of Wine virtual events for virtual tasting events for 2020, where we're breaking down our top 50 makers into a series of tasteable size chunks. And the chunk we have for you today is Geelong, Macedon, Yarra Valley, Mornington, as well as a feature on Gamay. We've got 7 winemakers there from our Young Gun of Wine 2020 Top 50 list, and they're joined by past finalists. We've got a ring-in, a special guest from with us about Gamay. And we also have another special guest, Jane Lopes, or Jane Lopes, who's dialing in all the way from Los Angeles. She had been a member of our tasting panel earlier this year, and she's a former beverage director at Attica during her time in Melbourne, or Australia rather. But we'll get to hear more about that in a few minutes. A couple of notes about the format for today. We're encouraging you to ask questions to our winemakers, and you do that by on the younggunofwine.com webpage where you're presently at. Beneath the video screen that you're looking at now, there's a section to ask proposed questions. So put them in there and we'll pick them up and put them to our winemakers when we have some Q&A panels later on. And also, we're encouraging you to get involved by way of posting Twitter comments. So jump onto Twitter, use the hashtag YGOW. We'll moderate those and get them on the screen during the live broadcast. And finally, if there's any technical jargon today that may fly over your head, which time to time can easily happen, we've got a glossary of terms that we've been establishing on our own website at younggunofwine.com/winespeak. So if you head to that page, you might find some quick definitions to some words that get thrown around by winemakers and others in the trade at time to time. So with all of that, let's get the lay of the land and bring up our map of Australia and check out, get a visualisation of where we're actually tasting today. So we're looking at the regions that circle Melbourne and Port Phillip Bay. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay heroes, all heroes in these regions, but of course there are differences between them. The Geelong region is quite diverse, whereas Mornington Peninsula is cooled on all sides by sea breezes. Geelong sprawls inland from its coastal areas, and within Geelong, where there is a freshness to the wines grown under the maritime influence, there are riper characteristics in those wines made from the warmer inland parts. Syrah is also a regional strength of Geelong, but from our top 50 makers today, we'll look at a Fumé Blanc from Mulline and a Gamay from Empire of Dirt. Across to Macedon, where whilst all of these regions that we're looking at are cool climate, Macedon takes the prize for being the coldest. Wine Australia ranges it between extremely cold and very cold, calling it Australia's coldest mainland region. How cold Macedon is depends on elevation. Vineyards at the 300 metres mark are naturally milder than those at 800 metres, while there's some genuine psychopaths who planted closer to 1,000 metres, and they would fall into the extremely cold camp. To date, Lyons, Wilimee and Dilworth and Allain all make up the 2020 Top 50 and will be with us. Across the Yarra, it's hard to mount an argument against the Valley being Australia's most important wine region. And by a stretch, Cabernet and Syrah are also strong suits of the Yarra. And from the Yarra, in our top 50 for the first time, is Tim Perrin and Oakridge, a producer which makes the gamut of wine styles in the region. And today we'll be taking a look at their Pinot Meunier. Are we back? All right, well, let's move on from the map. Apologies for the technical difficulty there. That's what happens when you do a live online event. So let's get Jane Lopes on the line and have a chat with Jane. Hey, Jane. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Yeah,
What
of course, my
time
pleasure.
of
Thanks for having me.
what time of night is it over there in LA?
It's 11 o'clock
Okay.
p.m.
All right. Well, we won't keep you up too late. We had John Ross
Thank you.
dialing in the other day, and it was 3 a.m. there at the time of our event here. So
Yeah, he's
so this is
hardier than I am.
okay. So let's get straight into it. Thank you so much for being a member of on our panel this year. This year has been a big year for yourself. You released a book, Vignette. Why don't you tell us about the book, and then we'll get stuck into some wine talk.
Yeah, it's called Vignette, Stories of Life and Wine in 100 Bottles. Basically, combination of personal narrative, sort of memoir, but also with some...
And come down under and experience wine firsthand.
Oh, it was so exciting. I mean, in the US, there's not very good exposure to Australian wine. So, we'd studied all these regions and all these wines and never had a chance to taste them. So it was just, incredibly exciting for me, for John and I to be able to, I'd never tasted a wine from Geelong before, or probably Mornington, probably Beechworth, probably only Heathcote and Yarra had I had wines from Victoria. It was just very limited. So it was incredibly exciting, and we, just traveled around a bunch and just wanted to kind of to taste and learn everything, and just incredibly, incredibly pleased with the quality too. The wine scene in Australia is just insane. There's just so much incredible wine. It was really, really exciting.
And what was that experience like coming from Manhattan into Melbourne, where you've got the Port Phillip zone, which are the regions we're looking at today. This city that is surrounded by regions from Geelong to Macedon to Yarra to Mornington. What was it like to have those regions on your doorstep?
I mean, it was the best. Like in New York, you have Long Island, you have Finger Lakes a little further out, but really, it wasn't, and you certainly don't have a car, so it was an incredibly different experience where we immediately knew we had to get a car so that we could go out and we could visit these regions. So we would just every weekend we'd go out and visit a different wine region, and it was the best. We just had such a good time, and I think that's the best way to learn, is to be out in regions and talking to producers and tasting the wines. So it was just so educational, and also really just a lot of fun.
So on to the wines today. You've had tasted all of these wines earlier this year when we assembled the panel together, but I was particularly interested, being the expert somm that you are, to get some thoughts from you around what are the things you think of to pair with the varietals that we're looking at today, being Chardonnay, Fumé Blanc, Pinot Meunier, Pinot Noir, Gamay.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with Chardonnay. I think, especially kind of the cool climate styles that we're looking at, you don't need like kind of the classic sort of blown out like lobster in a butter sauce. These are much more kind of restrained and fresh and acid driven styles. But I still think, I think Chardonnay at the end of the day is very versatile. But for me, kind of the perfect pairing would be something like, grilled fish, maybe sort of a brown butter and caper sauce. You want that touch of richness, but you also want acidity as well. Chardonnay gets this reputation for being a pretty big grape, but at the end of the day, it does have quite a bit of acid to it. For the Fumé Blanc style, and we're talking about Sauvignon Blanc here, made in a bit of a richer style, either with some oak or malolactic or even kind of a lees presence. So I think, again, these wines can handle a bit more heft, a bit more richness. But Sauvignon Blanc with its kind of pretty savory notes always goes well with vegetables too. So this is a good wine for, sort of those harder to pair vegetables, like an artichoke or asparagus or something like that. And then, Gamay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier are, sort of in a similar realm of that lighter bodied red wine. I think the main difference is you'll see Pinot Noir tends to be aged with some oak on it, which can make it, a better pairing for something that does have a bit more structure, a bit more richness, a bit more fat, something, I think in general you're looking at like richer white meats, I think quail or rabbit or something like that. Pinot Meunier to me has more of a little bit more of a sort of an orange fruit character, a little bit of like kind of almost an Italian feel to it sometimes. So I really like Pinot Meunier with like a tomato sauce or even a really good pizza wine. And Gamay is funny. You can get these really purple fruited kind of tannic expressions that can go well with everything, up to even including kind of darker red meats. I have a friend in New York who works at a Korean steakhouse and pairs a lot of the food there with Beaujolais, and it works very, very well. So I think actually the Gamay, because it has this slightly more purple fruit character, can go well with these sort of darker, heavier meats. But then, it's also pretty light and juicy. You can chill it and kind of have it as an aperitif. So, very, very versatile. All three of those wines are very versatile.
Great. Jane, love it. You're making me very hungry. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for staying up to join us.
And, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I look forward to speaking again soon. Have a good night. Okay, so let's crack on. Our first wine is from Macedon Chardonnay by way of Wilimee. Ben Ranken from Wilimee has been in our top 50 previously, and let's get him on to have a chat. He purchased his own vineyard out there in Macedon. How are you, Ben?
Well, Rory, yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. Hopefully we're through our only technical glitch today.
Yeah, sorry, mate.
So tell us about starting Wilimee and this vineyard site that Wilimee is.
Yeah. Look, mate, we were fortunate enough to buy one of the oldest vineyards in Mount Macedon. Firstly, a house to buy. Then we're looking for a block of land, and then my dad said, "Well, why don't you just go and buy a vineyard and see if what's about?" And fortunately, we were at Curly Flat having a glass of wine with Jenny, and she mentioned this old vineyard called Portree, and I'd never heard of it, and it was on the market 6 years previously, and I gave him a cold call. It was off the market. Gave him a cold call, and 6 months later, at Christmas time, we moved in. So it was very fortunate and fortuitous. And fell in love with the place straight away. It's one of those properties that as soon as you drive in the front gate, Sal, my wife, and I just fell in love with. And so that's where it all started. To find the property, we were very lucky. And so it's in the property's in the northeast corner of the Macedon Ranges at about 600 metres. And what I find quite unique about the place is that it's about 12 acres of vineyard, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet Franc. Because the sale of the property didn't go through, for, as I said, 6 to 7 years, it was quite dilapidated, didn't have any love. The pruning of the vines was shocking, and we had to rehabilitate the whole vineyard. As a result, there was a lot of dead arm, which is a trunk disease in the vine, and it can actually kill the vine. So we had to cut a lot of the vines back and start again. So the Cab Franc has all been mothballed and cut off at ground level to be regrow new trunks. And so we've had to put a lot of time and energy in rehabilitating this old vineyard, and it's taken time, and we're still going. But it's exciting, what we're drinking now, to be able to see the fruitfulness of these old vines in some really old soils.
You just mentioned Cab Franc there. I don't think I've seen a Cab Franc from you.
No, because we've cut it all out and regrowing a new trunk, we haven't had a crop at all. And that, to be honest with you, having the time and the energy to get another 2.5 acres of Cab Franc back up and running, we've got young kids, a mortgage, and it's just too hard. So we've had to mothball it and leave it, and hopefully one day I can get it back up and running and produce a Cab Franc or graft something onto it to. Who knows? We'll see where it goes.
Well, you're making some outstanding Pinot and Chardonnay, and talking about Chardonnay, it's a really interesting space to watch, because it's a space where today there's so much stylistic interpretation, and then over the years you see so many waves of styles emerge. We came out of this Chardonnay boom around, I don't know, the 90s or 2000s, where big buttery Chardonnays were the rage, and then the counter to that were these really linear, lean Chardonnays, where winemakers were picking earlier to deliver a Chardonnay that had perhaps less flavour profile and much more acidity on the palate. And so, and for a winemaker, it's I suppose can be a blank canvas with what the winemaker wants to do. That this Chardonnay that you've created, it's very zippy with acidity. It's got lots of stone fruits there, but it's not fruity per se. There's plenty of savoury characters there on the palate. I pick up this really gorgeous nougat thing going on. Tell us, what's your philosophy with Chardonnay making?
Well, yeah, look, having made wine for 20 years, I've seen those gamuts, as you mentioned, from the broad spectrum to the more linear spectrum. And really, when we bought the vineyard, I was more interested in learning about the vineyard and the vines and what fruit could be produced from the vines. And because when we bought it, they hadn't produced a wine for 7-8 years, we weren't able to taste what we were buying. So I really wanted to show the vineyard more than the winemaking. So first and foremost, we set out obviously rehabilitating the vines. And then when we pick the fruit, as you know, Mount Macedon Ranges we're 600 metres above sea level, so we're a cool climate, and we have great natural acidities and fantastic sugar levels too. So really, it was finding that balance of when to pick the fruit was the first key in deciding what sort of style we would make. I didn't determine what style I was after until really wanting to learn about the fruit. So the winemaking was very, very simple. We literally hand-picked the fruit and I pressed directly to barrel. So wild ferment in barrel. And what's great about fermenting in barrel or directly in barrel, so we would press direct to barrel. Each barrel is basically its own fermentation and its own press cut during the press, I suppose you would say. So you got to see, how the brightness of fruit and the core fruit came into play in those core middle barrels, but then towards the end, those last barrels that we'd pressed were obviously a little bit more phenolic and a bit more textural because of the harder pressings. So it was really cool to learn about how the fruit changed in style with each certain barrel. So obviously then we put all those barrels together. There was no intervention. There was a full malo in barrel. So that's one thing great about Macedon. These great acidities, you can have full malolactic. But we didn't work the wine. Basically, hands off, do not touch, low intervention. Literally press the wine, get it through ferment, get it through malo, and walk away. And malo wouldn't finish, the 2018, the wine you're drinking at the moment, didn't finish malo until Christmas, about a week before Christmas. So it's a long time. You've got to hold your breath. And I'm really more interested in expressing the vineyard and the fruit being the vineyard rather than the winemaking. So the only artifact in this wine is obviously oak, and that's 25% new oak, French oak, obviously. So that's really the only artifact. I would then look at pulling the wine out of barrel literally the day before we picked the next vintage to keep those barrels fresh, and they weren't there's no sulfur use or anything like that. And they went into tank by gravity, and then we rack on 2 consecutive new moons to bottle. So new moons was a really, really important process. And there we have it. That's the wine that represents the vineyard, and that was what we were trying to aim for, was a representation of the vineyard rather than aiming for a broad style or a lean style. This is what Macedon is. It's the vineyard. This is our property. This is the fruit. I just wanted to bring it to the fore.
Can you explain the new moons part?
Yes, of course. Basically, in a nutshell, a very simple process is when the wine's in barrel, obviously it has sediment. And on a full moon, which is when the moon is closest to the earth, it has its most powerful gravitational impact on the earth. So the sediment would rise and you'd naturally have a cloudy barrel. And that's why, Bells Beach Surf Classic is on a full moon, being Easter, king tides are on a full moon, because you've got the gravitational pull of the moon. So the opposite to that is 14 days later, during the new moon, when there is no moon. And that's when this has its least effect on the earth, and therefore the sediment in the barrel is at its most compact. And therefore you're racking or taking the wine out of the barrel and leaving all those solids behind without taking any hazy, cloudy elements into the wine.
And you also mentioned a few times malolactic fermentation. Do you want to just explain what that's about?
Yeah. It's a secondary fermentation. It's most common in red wines, and Chardonnay is one of the few white wines. There are a few other exceptions where Malo is accepted in white wines, but basically it's a secondary fermentation of the wine after it goes through primary. So there's no more sugar left in the wine, and it's basically a bacterial fermentation, converting lactic acid into malic acid, which is a softer acid on the palate. And that's really imperative for Macedon because we have such high natural acidities. So therefore we can get away with full malolactic fermentation to convert that harder lactic acid into a softer malic acid. Makes it more palatable and easier drinking and delicious.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to keep moving now, but stick around because we'll drag you back for some Q&A with the audience. So see you soon.
Fantastic, mate. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay, our next wine from Port Phillip Estate, and we'll grab Glen Hayley on the line whilst I'm introducing this wine. We're looking at their Mornington single block Chardonnay, 2018 vintage. This is the first vintage of this wine. Glen, how are you?
Hey, Rory, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So within the Port Phillip range, this is now your top Chardonnay. What led you to make the wine bottle as a single block?
It's been our philosophy across the business, single block wines, single vineyard wines, and we never had the Chardonnay in the Port Phillip range. And the vineyard's now 30, or just over, and it seemed right. Like the vines in that older block were really showing themselves to be quite unique, quite different, intense, complex, and we like to celebrate that you get this beautiful little patch in the vineyard, and instead of blending it away into the bigger mix, we bottle it separately and sort of show off the characteristics of the vineyard, or that part of the vineyard.
We're just chatting to Ben about stylistic approaches to Chardonnay, and looking at this Chardonnay, it seems to be cut from a very similar cloth. This Chardonnay has plenty of flavour, but it also has plenty of restraint, and there's some real savoury characters to the wine, and some toasty characters as well. Do you want to chat us through your winemaking approach, and as well, has your approach with Chardonnay changed over the years?
Yeah, I think it mirrors a lot of what Ben was talking about just before. In terms of changes, I think the biggest ones for us with Port Phillip, it's a cooler site. So not as cool as Macedon, but cool for Mornington. So we get plenty of acidity. So since 2018, we've been using, 2017 actually, a little bit of malolactic as well, just to soften the acid a little bit, take the edge off, which with our sister property at Kooyong, being a warmer site, we've always stepped away from that to sort of retain the acidity and keep it tight, keep it fresh. Whereas Port Phillip, it was almost too much acidity. So it's a beautiful little tool, adds a little creaminess to the palate, a little softness, but still holds all the intense acid. And stylistically, I'd say we make wine in a reductive style to mirror Ben. I think that whole bunch pressed, straight to barrel, wild ferment, sitting on lees the entire time. We never rack the wine. We're never there to encourage oxygen, and that can pick up some of those really interesting sort of flinty, sulphidey, toasty notes that I think really complementary. Chardonnay, I love that character in the wines. So I think over the years, we're just trying to find the balance, because as you mentioned, you can swing wildly in this industry from, full-bodied, big-blown Chardonnays out to the opposite. I think the in-between is the ultimate goal for us, which is a little bit of that richness, but acidity and complexity and all that kind of edginess that comes with the reductive winemaking.
And looking inside the glass, can you see the characters here that scream of its origins, this single block?
It's interesting because this property's 30 years old, and it's been with the family that own us. They've owned it for over 20 years now, and I still feel like we're learning the property. The way the guys are growing the grapes in the last couple of years has been a big step up, and we're starting to see characters that we never really saw in there before. So we're still learning, but structure, power, a lot of citrus flavors like grapefruit, mandarin, things like that, and a little bit of stone fruit. That kind of seems to be the direction it's taking, and add to that the barrel ferment and the barrel aging, and you get this nice, powerful, intense style of Chardonnay.
Gorgeous. Love it. Glen, thank you so much. Stick around. We'll grab you back in a few minutes for a chat with the audience. Okay. So we're heading across the bay to Geelong. Brand new label, Mulline, made by Ben Mullen. He's in the top 50 again this year. This is the first edition of his own project. So let's grab Ben on to have a chat about it. Fumé Blanc. It's a stylistic approach to Sauvignon Blanc. So Ben, first question: How do you make a wine? How do you make a Sauv Blanc not taste like Sauv Blanc?
Don't treat it like Sauv Blanc. I think that's kind of was my motto going into this. Fumé is an interesting style for me. I like working with oak and lees and skin. And Sauv Blanc is one of those aromatic varieties that can hold it, and it uses it as a complexing agent to the wine rather than being overtly tropical and quite boring in its approach, if you can call some of those wines, I guess.
I mean, taking a look at this wine, it's not what you'd expect from a varietal Sauv Blanc. It's there's real savouriness and a herbaceousness to it. The colour of it is really a pale straw hue. There's a lot of there's grapefruit sort of notes in the wine. There's plenty of texture, and there's what I love so much about this wine is that that struck match sort of that flinty, smoky sort of struck match character in there.
Yeah.
So well done, love it.
Yeah, thank you.
Why?
Yeah.
So you've created this new label, and one of the wines you first release is a Fumé Blanc. What? Why were you struck to make a Fumé Blanc?
I think my kind of background has been predominantly Sauvignon as an aromatic white. So I spent a few years in New Zealand and got to make a lot of Sav and got to work with it in various different ways. And previous to doing my line, I had a couple of years at Clyde Park, which is another Geelong winery, and implemented a Fumé Blanc in there. I love the fruit that we get from our region with Sauvignon. So interestingly enough, people, especially with Pinot Noir, talk about clones, and there's also a lot of very distinct differences between clones and Sauvignon. So the one that we have in our region, especially in Moorabool, is an old Bordeaux clone from the 1880s, and smaller bunches. You get a lot more kind of grapefruit pith, kind of citrus notes, and I like to see the tropical notes hit more at the feijoa kind of spicy end rather than the kind of green pineapple-y tropical end. So it's one of those kind of wines which I think is made in the vineyard with these old kind of limestone clay soils which limit production of fruit but also give some of these really beautiful kind of citrus notes. So, and with making the wine, I kind of treat it like I do Chardonnay. So get a little bit of time on skins just to build a little bit of tannin to the wine, and then kind of like Ben and Glen with Chardonnay, kind of press it straight to barrel with full solids, natural ferment, and no touching it until it's ready to go to bottle kind of at the end of the year. So I don't really like to play with it too much, but I like to build texture and structure into the wine, and that's with using a little bit of new oak with, and with this wine I've used some Austrian wood rather than kind of typical French, and then some older barrels in there as well. Yeah.
And so in this wine, there's no overt tropical notes that you might expect to find from the variety. Does that come from the vineyard, or is it to do with the decisions around when you pick the fruit and how ripe the fruit is?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. I think with Sav, if you do pick it a bit too early, you will get those kind of green grassy notes. And if you're making a wine as a full blend, that can be a useful tool with blending. But because this is a single vineyard wine and it's only one pick, so I was kind of looking for kind of pushing it a little bit further and trying to build a little bit more of those kind of grapefruit kind of citrus rind characters. So I kind of sits on the vine a tiny little bit longer, but that helps with just getting rid of that green grassy note and bringing in more of the kind of lemongrass aromatics that I like to see in this wine.
I've got a personal theory that sometimes when you see saline notes or briny notes in wines, it's due to the maritime or the that salt sort of sea spray influence in the environment. And when I look at this wine, I can see a bit of a briny note in there. Do you think that's coming from the proximity to the bay waters?
Yeah, I mean this vineyard's about 30 kilometers towards Ballarat from the coast, so we do see a little bit coming from kind of through where the surf coast is coming through towards Geelong. But I think the minerality from this is more coming from that kind of really rich limestone. Where the property is that I source this fruit from, it is an old inland sea, so there's a lot of really old fossil and limestone, and I think that's where you get that kind of minerality and that salinity from. But yeah, I think, and that's definitely more kind of pushing towards the texture of it.
There we go. All right, Ben. Let's jump into the Q&A with the audience, and let's get our other friends back on the line. Ben from Wilimee, and we've got two Bens and a Glen.
Makes it easy,
fellas.
Oh yeah.
Glen, first one's for you. What do you think is unique about Mornington compared to the other Victorian regions?
I think you mentioned it at the very start. It's that maritime influence. Like, you can get pockets of it in Geelong over the other side, but in Mornington, it's everywhere. So I'd say that's number one. And the secondly is the red hill, the red soil as well, that you do see in other parts of the country, but we're fortunate we have red soil and a maritime influence, and that plays gives a real difference to the climate that you don't see when you're more inland. So more influence, less heat in the summer, and not as cold at nights or during the winter, which plays a big part.
Ben, here we go. How did you feel confident to buy your vineyard when the vines were in such shocking condition and wine hadn't been made there for so long? Did you worry you were setting yourself up for disaster?
Yeah, bloody oath. That's the nuts and bolts of it, definitely. I had to rely on anecdotal evidence by talking to other winemakers who had bought fruit off that vineyard before. Hanging Rock actually managed it for those 6 or 7 years in between. So had a good chat to those guys there, and people bought fruit from them as well that they made for. Traditionally, Macedon Ranges has been a sparkling-based region. And I spoke to the guys from Domaine Chandon, actually John O'Harris, who's now at Mitchell Harris in Ballarat. He loved the fruit. He always said it was the best parcel of fruit that came into the winery every year, even though it was only a small parcel, but he said it was fantastic. So I had to trust others, really. And now Jono is one of the guys who buys a little bit of fruit off me to make his sparkling called Sabre. So so the proof's in the pudding. It's just I had to trust friends and talk to other winemakers.
Glen, I read that you use gravity to move fruit and wines rather than pumps. How important do you think that is?
I think it's very important. We're talking about Chardonnay. So Chardonnay in particular, we handpick everything, and we want to retain those bunches and whole bunch press them, not move the fruit, not macerate the fruit. So we go to all that effort to handpick them. So we want to be able to tip them. It's more in relation for our winery, for our Pinot Noir making, and it's vital to what we do. It brings a prettiness and a delicacy and detail and fineness to the wine that if you are a bit strong or heavy-handed, especially Pinot, it can really put an influence on the wine that we're not into. So we definitely strive, and it makes everything a bit slower, a bit harder, but the end product is well worth it.
Ben, Geelong vineyards seem to have a really distinctive imprint in the wine, especially in the Moorabool Valley. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a pretty interesting little sub-region of Geelong. I think it is definitely to do with soils, so it's those kind of rich limestones and that kind of heavy clay, and it's kind of a bit of has a bit of a rain gap. So we get all these kind of clouds going over the Otways and then going over the Kooyongs, but we kind of get mist. So rainfall was not high, so vines do crop a lot lower. So we get a lot of really good concentration. We have cool nights in summer, so acid is really well retained, and we have really long ripening, especially in kind of vintages like 17, 19, where things just held on the vine for weeks and weeks and had a lot of really good flavour retention that way.
Ben, next question is again for you. What are the hallmarks of Fumé Blanc?
Hallmarks of Fumé Blanc. I think, for me, the main kind of hallmark for it is not make it look like Sav, and for people to drink it. I think, it's definitely the kind of savouriness and the structure and the tannin for me, and building kind of freshness into the wine, but still kind of adding all little bits of pieces to it to make it an interesting drink. Yeah.
Glen, how does using Indigenous yeast affect the end result?
That's a good question. That's a pretty vital part of our process, I guess. You know, when you're striving to make these individual single block, single vineyard wines, you kind of want that identity coming entirely out of that vineyard, and a big part of that is the fermentation and the yeast source. So you can buy yeast and add it that will, you know, apparently highlight certain characteristics and flavors and do things, but we want to use the yeast that's inbuilt into that property and part of our growing program and part of our, even in our house style as such in the winery, and it puts its own fingerprint on the wine itself. So because of that, we feel like it's just that extra step towards that individual block showing its true self, which goes all the way down to the microbe level. Very important.
And Glen, again for you. And this one comes from Peter Foster. What have you changed in the winemaking since Sandro left to make the wine style your own? Sandro is a great winemaker.
Oh, there you go. Not a lot in the Chardonnay sense. Tweaking, I think we've changed, sort of pushing more for a bit more freshness and brightness in the wines, bottling a little bit earlier, maybe just being a little more focused on purity of the wine. The big change, I think, has been in the vineyards, to be honest, that the winery has always processed quite well and flowed quite well, but the vineyards where we had some inconsistencies, and that's just trying to work those out. And I think that's seen a really big improvement that, you know, we make something like 23 different wines, I think it is, from, you know, tiny little single block wines like this through to bigger blends. And we want them all to have a consistency, and that's starts in the vineyard and flows into the winery after that. So I'd say that's the biggest change, is out in the vineyard.
Ben, what characteristics do you typically achieve from an Austrian oak?
It's actually quite a subtle oak. It's more about the structure that I'm getting from those barrels. So I'm using 300 litre barrels, which is kind of in the mid-range of size. And it's all about kind of giving a little bit of a kind of toasty, spicy lift. But for me, it's all about kind of building the structure from the oak. And it's a light toast, and they toast it for a really long time. So it's all about kind of getting that really nice kind of structural phenolic that I see in the wine.
Ben, do you have to filter or fine your Chardonnay if you're removing it from the barrel on the new moon when the lees are compacted?
No, that's the whole point, so that you can rack directly from barrel to bottle. So there's no intervention at all, no filtering, no fining, no stabilisation. By leaving the wine in barrel on gross lees for 12 months at least, there's a lot of natural stabilisation that occurs anyway in that oxidative barrique, and so you don't have to stabilise or fine or do anything. So really, the less the better, and that's just one of the ways of getting around not having a cloudy wine and not filtering.
Ben, super excited about the new label. Will you work with other varietals in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be adding a few new wines for the 2020, so that's pretty exciting. Making some Riesling and a few more Pinots and Chardonnays. But, you know, you never know what kind of pops up in the future, and if I do end up planting a vineyard, what I will plant. It's kind of a bit of a see what is around the region. And it's an interesting region where there are some new varieties being planted, young vines. So fingers crossed they'll kind of come into their own. There'll be a few more things to play with.
Ben, when do you bottle? Is it on a full moon?
No, I bottle literally. I lock in a bottling date, and then work back with respect to the new moons as according to the rackings. So usually I'll try and get a bottling date as close to the new moon as possible, ideally 3 or 4 days after the new moon. So that's literally the last racking I'll have before going to bottle, hopefully within a week of that last racking. So really on a, waxing moon.
Gentlemen, that was the final question. We're all done. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a lot of fun. And so let's move on to our next one, which is the Oakridge Pnemonia. This is made by Tim Perrin. And Pnemonia, for those of you who may not be aware, is typically seen as a blending component of champagne. And there's not many producers in Australia making Pnemonia as a varietal red wine. And Tim is going to jump online and tell us. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Hi, Rory. How are you?
Good, thank you. Before we chat in too much specifics about the wine, I'm curious to know how your cellar door goes at communicating the Pnemonia proposition to new customers, because in Australia there might be around 20 Pnemonias at most, so it's rarely seen.
Yeah, I mean, our cellar door guys, they're quite in tune with the people that come in, and people generally that look towards a Pinot Noir per se. We make 6, 7 different Pinots. They're going to be pretty receptive to a Pinot Meunier because the wine style is similar. It's less tannic than Pinot Noir, but I mean the guys at cellar door, they're pretty keen to get into those people's brains and say, hey, this is something new. It's like Pinot. Do you want to try it? Hey, you might like it. You never know.
This I have to say, I love Pinot Meuniers, and I love what you've done with this Pinot Meunier. I just pouring it into the glass now, immediately as you start to draw your nose to the glass, you're hit with these gorgeous, fun, vibrant, fruity aromatics. Very, very, very playful, and then when you taste it, the wine starts to show a sort of a deeper and darker dimension where there's some wildness to it. Do you approach the winemaking of this wine differently to your other reds?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Pinot Meunier as a grape variety, it doesn't have a lot of tannin per se. So you don't want to work the fruit too hard. You want to be as gentle as possible. And this wine style, it is all about the fruit and the liveliness, and you want to personify those characters. You want to bring them to the fore. So we probably hold it on skins for say a week less than Pinot Noir. We don't use any new oak in this wine. It's all old wood, just to keep that vibrancy and that freshness and just that lovely fruit pop.
How long is it between harvest and when you bottle the wine?
Yeah, so we look towards a mid-year bottling. So it's generally depending on when vintage finishes or starts, 2 to 3 months in old French oak puncheons. So not a really long time. It'll just stay in there just to go through malolactic fermentation, and as soon as it's finished malo, we'll just rack it into tank and add a little bit of sulfur, and then get ready for bottling.
So would you describe this as a nouveau style wine that's inspired by the Gamays of Beaujolais?
Yeah, certainly. It is definitely a nouveau style. It's bottled early, released early, to be enjoyed within the 12-month cycle. Gamay for us, we don't have any Gamay that we have access to, so this is our Beaujolais-esque style wine. It's definitely wine for the wine for the tummy, not wine for the brain, so to speak.
And in the winemaking, is there any carbonic maceration going on?
Yeah, certainly. So we use 100% whole berries on this, and so we de-stem the fruit, but it's whole berry because we still want to get that carbonic character into that wine. It gives you that fruit pop, that lovely sort of red berry, that slight sort of that little spice element that's in there as well. That's all from the carbonic fermentation.
And how do you describe carbonic fermentation to someone who hadn't heard of that before?
Yeah, so carbonic fermentation is essentially the fermentation starting within the berry of the grape. So if you imagine that's your berry, rather than having all the juice on the outside, you got to still keep the juice on the inside, and all the fermentation happens. So that's pretty much in layman's terms.
And by doing that, fermentation in an environment that's starved of oxygen, it imparts into the wine these really gorgeous fruity characters. You could sometimes almost describe them as bubblegum like.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it sort of leans toward that bubblegum, blue fruit-esque, and that reduction just sort of adds that element as well.
Tim, thanks so much for joining us. Stick around. We'll be back with you in a few minutes to take some questions for the audience.
Not a problem.
So our next wine comes from a really exciting new label called Dilworth and Allain. They're based in Macedon, and this is their Doug's Vineyard Pinot Noir. And we'll get Chris Dilworth and Loïque Allain on the line. This is a winemaking husband and wife duo. This is a new label of theirs. They do everything from farming fruit to making wine, and indeed designing wine labels. But we'll get to the wine labels in a minute. Chris, Loïque, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us what attracted you to the Macedon, because I don't think neither of you are from Macedon.
No.
So what attracted you there?
We started coming to the Macedon, I think, like in 2013, or Chris might have been before me, visiting Cobor Ridge. Josh Cooper is from this region, and he studied with Chris at uni, and we were always invited on long weekends or holidays to come up and visit and spend a lot of time with Nellie and Alan. And it just sort of started our love for the region.
And tell us about the Doug's Vineyard.
So it's a special spot. It sits around 520 metres, so it's a cool climate. Its soil profile is a mix of red basalt with some, it's primarily red basalt, which means it has a large percentage of clay. And from that, you get a really good water holding capacity, which is just basically indicates that the vines don't have to work too hard for water, but they're not irrigated either. So it's a special vineyard. Primarily, it's the right variety, grown in the right spot. It's really well managed and is 20 years old, so it's starting to show some maturation. The vines are really starting to sink in.
This is such a gorgeous and super intriguing Pinot. It's brooding, and it's got these really cool fruits of red fruits and darker fruits that have a slightly sour edge to it. It's got some spice in there. It's got this sort of autumnal sensation in it with those sort of wild, savoury characters coming through. What was the biggest decision that you've had to make in making this wine?
I think probably the biggest decision you make is picking, the date of picking. So achieving the optimal ripeness, which is going to give you the resulting alcohol, and finding that balance. Not going too early and not going too late. It's a bit like the Three Little Bears. And I really feel like that is probably one of the biggest decisions you make all year. But prior to that, it's a selection of different clones, which means different representations of Pinot Noir. So there's a variety of those, but then also the way it's managed throughout the growing season and through its whole life. And I really feel like it starts on the picking date. It's one of the biggest things you'll do all year. So.
And so when it comes to picking date, what are you looking for?
yeah, it's balance of flavour. It's obviously not wanting to go too far, looking at the weather which is coming, knowing what's past. There's many different things that kind of come into
And what
play.
the berry, like what the fruit is tasting like, what the skin is, what's happening with the skin and the seed, like, yeah, I guess all of that stuff. And then,
can you get pickers?
yeah, and rain, I guess, because once you start getting into autumn, it can get wet here.
Yeah, generally we pick in late March or early April, so it's a little bit later than a lot of other Australian wine regions for Pinot Noir, being an earlier ripening variety. So definitely dealing with that autumn break of rain that can make things a bit tricky.
And what are some of the key winemaking components that are translating to what's in the glass here?
Yeah, I suppose a less is more approach. That's generally what we aim for. But there's some of the whole bunches retained, which means we de-stem some of the grapes from the bunches, but then we leave some in there also. So that adds to the carbonic maceration you were talking about with Tim, being inside the grape and has a different aromatic profile. And not extracting the wine too heavily. We usually leave it on skins for the fermentation period of around 2 to 3 weeks, and we use a basket press for pressing, which we find is it's just different. You could use many different types of presses, but we feel the basket press really just gives a really good savoury edge to the wine,
and sort of clarity when you're actually pressing.
That
like
also,
when you're pressing with the basket press, the juice is clear for ages. Like it's got that clarity. Yeah.
So and then the wine spends 12 months in oak, so that has a big influence on how the resulting wine will taste.
Yeah.
And then giving it more time, we don't bottle the wines for generally 16 months. So they have a period of élevage or maturation to allow it to express itself and develop.
And Loïque, I love what you've created here with this label.
Yeah,
I'm going to get the wine label held up in front of the camera so everyone can get a better look at it. And we've got to try and get that in focus.
Not quite.
We're struggling. Here we go. Can the camera? There we go. It started to focus. So, Loïque, can you please chat us through what the artwork is and how you created it?
The artwork is Lake Daylesford. It's a bird's eye view of where, like, the common ground of this region, I guess, and this little community. We had actually done a few other labels, and we just weren't. They just didn't feel right. And I think I was in the car one day, and I said, we're probably coming back from the lake swimming, because we're actually both love the ocean, and so water's like a big part of our life. So that was a big decision coming here as well, like not being close to the ocean, but the lakes here. So in summer, we spend a lot of time there swimming, having picnics, and it's a lino cut. So most people have done lino cuts in high school, I guess, but I found that quite young in my life, and I've just kept on doing it, for forever pretty much. So it's a lino cut of Lake Daylesford.
Is lino cut a medium that you work with constantly at the moment, or do you work with other artistic mediums?
Mainly lino cut. I do a little bit of acrylic painting and texture drawing and watercolours with Odette and Arthur, but primarily lino. Yeah, we have one underneath the computer now. But, yeah.
So I'm really super interested to know you've both got winemaking backgrounds to different degrees, and you're both creative people. When it comes to the making of wine of the wines under your label, do you two have creative differences?
Yeah, they come up.
Things pop up all the time, and
Yeah.
Loïque and I have been together for more than 10 years, and we've travelled a lot and consumed a lot of different wine, and there's definitely things that pop up along the way.
Yeah.
And I guess we express our opinions and make
we
a
just
decision.
talk about it. But I think generally we enjoy the same kind of wines, and
yeah, we're pretty much aligned on that.
Yeah.
But
things do come up, just like in any relationship, and you have to like learn to work together and
make a decision, and then
and go with it and see what happens.
Yeah, you try it in some time, and you look back and think, oh, maybe we could have done it maybe a little bit differently, or that was probably the best way to go, or that worked out really well. So it's just like bouncing ideas off each other, and sometimes there's a wall and sometimes there's a soft place the idea is received.
Yeah, and I think as we've gone along, because we're only like the early years, I think as we go along it'll probably get easier, because we'll hopefully be working with the same vineyards and know what the wine needs or not doesn't need as we go on, I guess.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's jump into some Q&A from the audience now, and we'll get Tim back on the line. And let me see here. Tim, the first question's for you. How do you find Pnemonia to work with in the vineyard?
The vineyard site itself is a little challenging, because there's a dip in the vineyard. So basically it goes down a slope and then comes up. So there's several sections in the vineyard. The bottom part of the vineyard, which is the coolest part, gets the most shade. We actually pick for sparkling base, and the upper parts we pick for table red wine. So it's about sort of, picking those different sections and making the wines accordingly.
Chris and Loïque, can you tell us what's special about the Doug's vineyard?
There's many things, but yeah, it's the right variety grown in the right place. It's really well suited to that spot. Macedon Ranges being a cool climate, Pinot Noir, and then I guess the soil profile having its own contribution, and the vineyard's not irrigated, so the vines have to work quite hard for what they get in terms of water, and the rainfall has to be right to make to get the right kind of production.
There's diverse clones in the vineyard, which
it's a real mix. There's many contributing factors. It's really, I guess, they all add up and contribute in a positive way.
Tim, do you see your Pnemonia as a wine for cellaring?
Look, no, certainly not. It's definitely a wine for the now. It's made deliberately that way to be enjoyed young and fresh. I have had older bottles of this wine, and it does retain some freshness, but I mean, definitely in that sort of 24 to 18 month window is the ideal drinking time, definitely.
Chris and Loïque, what are the different subregions of the Macedon ranges?
Well, I suppose it starts as you're just going north from Sunbury. That's where the geographical indication commences, and from there is Gisborne, which is home to Bindi, and there's a few other little wineries around there. And then as you head north, you'll continue on to Woodend, and in that little sub-region there's Hanging Rock, and you can go east or west from there. Most of the vineyards as you're heading north from Woodend are to the east, and that's where you'll find Romsey, and then from there where Ben is located, which is Lancefield, Ben from Wilimee, and also Renata and Ollie from Lyons. And then if you continue further north, you'll come to the Cobble Ranges, and then you go over the Cobble Ranges and you hit onto the north side, and on a sunny day you'll be looking at Heathcote from there. So it's slightly warmer, but depending on altitude that changes. And then you've kind of got a little bit more, some more vineyards over in the east, which is closer to the township of Kyneton.
Tim, what food is best paired with Pnemonia? I haven't heard of this variety as a table red wine before. This is very new and exciting.
Oh, well, I mean, the Meunier for me, personally, it's the ultimate pizza wine. So, you know, a good wood-fired pizza with this goes awesome. But, you know, it's being Pinot Meunier, it's, you know, very similar food matches to Pinot Noir. It doesn't quite have the tannin cut through, but, you know, but sort of, you know, gamey meat, things like duck, you know, the traditional stereotypes also work well. But, yeah, wood-fired pizza for me, 100%.
Tim, is there a concrete definition of new versus old oak, i.e., does a barrel have to be used for a certain number of vintages before it would be called old?
Yeah, well, I mean, I see oak influence in barrels for up to sort of 5 years, depending on the cooperage and the level of toast. So anything after sort of 5 years is deemed to be old. Anything that doesn't impart any oak flavour into the wine is what I call old oak.
Chris and Loïque, how big is the Doug's vineyard? Is it close planted?
It's 6 acres in total. It's not close planted. It's traditional Australian style. So the row widths in between is 3 metres, 2.8. And then in between each vine is approximately 1.5 metres. So lots of room for a big Australian tractor to fit down there.
Chris and Loïque again, any new varieties on the horizon for you or the region in general?
Not necessarily for us, I don't think at the moment. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. But and in the region,
I mean, yeah, so at the moment we're producing a Chardonnay, Riesling and a Pinot Noir, and that's what we produced this year in the harvest of 2020. And yeah, hopefully next year there's some opportunity to make some more wine. So.
More wine as in more varietals or more volume of those existing wines?
Both.
Yeah.
Great, love it. Chris and Loïque, who is Doug?
Doug is the owner.
Yeah.
He is a wine lover, so he planted the vineyard in the year 2000, and he is just obsessed with red wine and had to have a vineyard in his house, and so it's named after him.
It's a very creative name for a vineyard. And that is a wrap, guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're dismissed.
Thank you, Rory.
Thank you very much, Tim, Chris, Loïque. Thank you so much. Okay, so cracking on. We're onto our Gamay palette. We're onto the Gamays. And we're starting with the 2018 Thick as Thieves Gamay, which comes from the King Valley, which is just northeast of Yarra Valley. And we have a special guest, Syd Bradford of Thick as Thieves, who's a past finalist in our awards, joining us. G'day, Syd. How are you? Do we have audio for Syd?
That's my fault. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
I am not very good at this.
The audio might be a bit soft, Syd. So perhaps try talking into the microphone a little bit more. That would be the other side.
How are we looking there?
Oh, coming through clear as a bell. Lovely. Thanks, Syd. Just don't move.
I'm just keeping you on your toes, Rory.
So before we get stuck into Gamay, on a more personal note, I think it'd be really interesting to ask you, as a small producer as a winemaker who's started his own business. You were in our awards about 10 years ago, and you've just recently built your own winery, and your production volume is relatively very, very small. Tell us what is that journey like that you're on?
Exciting and stressful. It's a dream come true, really. I feel very privileged to be able to, ride the wave, and 10 years later still be in business, and even turning a profit, believe it or not. It's obviously an industry that, regardless of your scale, it's capital intensive. You need a lot of equipment. You need, you're outlaying constantly, whether it's for barrels or fruit or presses or tanks. So it helps to have some backing, which my wonderful wife has, she's allowed me to pump most of the money from the business back in year after year for 10 years, which has got me to the point now where, we can start to turn a profit. So you imagine a business that takes 10 years of non-stop work to actually just make a buck. It's quite a ride.
So onto Gamay. Outside of your own, I can't recall. There's one other Gamay I can certainly recall trying, but not much. Is there much Gamay in King Valley, or is the vineyard you're sourcing from the only vineyard with Gamay in King Valley?
At this stage, I think John Darling, he's Kumbala Vineyard in Whitfield. He's one of the few that, as most people may know, you can graft over, and that's what John's done. So he's taken a few varieties that haven't that have kind of lost popularity, Cabernet being one of them, and grafted over to Gamay, which he continues to do year after year. There's more and more because it's in such demand. Gamay is relatively new in terms of to Australia, so it's being planted all over the place, mostly the cooler climates and the cooler regions. So it really hasn't necessarily found its home yet, which is exciting. And I think the King is really going to play an important role over the next 10 and 20 years to see how it all pans out.
It seems winemakers today see it as a variety that could be well suited in these regions where Pinot Noir is grown, because if you look to France, where Gamay hails from Beaujolais, and Beaujolais is south of Burgundy, and making Beaujolais a warmer region, and I think winemakers here have the idea that Gamay is going to be suited to slightly warmer conditions than perhaps Pinot Noir. You're working a lot between King Valley and Yarra Valley. How do you see it being adopted amongst those places, and what's your gauge on its prospects?
Well, like you mentioned, with its origins in France, Beaujolais is slightly warmer to the south of Burgundy. So it's thicker skin, so it tends to handle the warmer areas better. And so I suppose with the warming that we're seeing in general, where we may just see a shift from regions where it's getting slightly too warm for Pinot, they may shift over to Gamay. That would make sense. So, and obviously a lot of regions we've got altitude to work with, certainly in the Yarra and the King as well. So the Pinot might get pushed up the hill, and the Gamay kind of sits more on the valley floor.
Let's look at what's in the glass here. This is a super interesting and super approachable wine that you've made. There's lots of red and black fruits in there. There's florals in there. You get some sort of like chocolate and coffee notes coming through. There's earthy characters. There's this really sort of strong line of peppermint throughout it. There's not a huge degree of oak in the wine. How do you approach the winemaking?
Very similar to Pinot. In terms of picking, it's probably, I do two picks, so one for a blend and the other for this wine. And that the second pick always goes into the straight Gamay. Once it gets to the winery, though, it's almost identical to the way I would make a Pinot, with the exception of extraction, which is certainly extraction in the later part of the ferment. So with those thicker skinned I was talking about and the bigger bunches, they lend themselves to a little bit more work. So I generally pump over for most, certainly the start of the ferments. And then when we started the peak ferment, which is depending on the cold soak, it's usually after 10 days or more, and the temperatures are starting to creep up to around that 30-degree mark, then I'll work it harder to get a bit more extraction than I would do in a Pinot. Other than that, probably a little bit less new oak. Like you mentioned, with those characteristics, there's a little bit there. But I'm trying. I know it's such a fruit-driven, supple tannin wine, and a wine that its versatility is probably the one thing that really attracts me to it. And you can chill it in summer. You can blend it. You can make rosé out of it if you want to as well, similar to Pinot. So I'm looking to make it more appealing as a really young wine. Yeah.
How long have you been working with Gamay?
Since 2014. So John grafted over in about 12. So not long after I started working with him up in Whitfield, and then put my hand up in straight away in the early days, and what's that? 6 years now. Yeah. And
do you find your approach to the winemaking with the grape has changed over that time?
Probably heading towards more whole bunch. So in the initial stages, I was destemming more, and that's probably the only shift, to be honest. Everything's that would be the only shift in terms of. I've always used large format oak. I've always used indigenous yeast. Picking time hasn't varied that much, so I'd like to keep it simple.
And you describing your winemaking, you've spoken about a few terms, whole bunch and also your extraction. Would you like to just briefly explain what you're talking about there for those new to those terms?
Sure. So whole bunch means we as the fruit's hand-picked, which all my fruit is hand-picked, it goes into the ferment vessel, which is open-top fermenters, just basically massive stainless steel pots on their stem. So you get the carbonic maceration, which I heard you talking about before, leading to these really fruit-driven wines. You also get a much cooler ferment, which is something that, for me, with the cooler ferment, you get a more mild extraction, and you end up with more delicate feminine wines, but you also get flavours from those stems as well. So they impart an extra level of spice that complements the wine.
Syd, thank you so much. Stick around. We'll grab you back in a few minutes for some to answer some questions with the audience. And from one Gamay in one region to another Gamay in the next. Lyons Will, really exciting project by Renata Morello. We'll get Renata on the line and have a chat to her about it. So Renata and her husband have their own vineyard, and this is from their range of wines. It's a fantastic Gamay you've made here, Renata. What other grapes are you growing there at Lyons Will Estate?
Yeah, so we bought an established vineyard back in 2013. So Pinot and Chardonnay were the original plantings, and then we planted in November 13 some Gamay and Riesling.
Now, I believe you're the first in Macedon to plant Gamay. What led you to plant Gamay?
Really just because it's a variety that we like drinking. And I guess you don't really want to be making wine that you don't enjoy drinking yourself. But also because we were looking for a variety that we could ripen in the Macedon Ranges. So Macedon Ranges is quite a cool climate. So it's got the coldest sort of region within mainland Australia. It gets quite cold at night, and so it's actually really hard to ripen some of those bigger reds. So we really needed an alternative to Pinot, but that had the ability to ripen within these cool environments and in this marginal site. I don't know, Gamay is fun, it's dynamic, it represents site, but it also allows you to have a bit of a ability to kind of play with it in the winemaking process as well. And, you know, I think being a new label, a new brand, a new business, we really wanted to do something that was a bit new and a bit different for the region. So, yeah, thought that Gamay would be a good place, a good variety to grow in this region, but also something that we could really make our own and, yeah, do something that was a bit different.
I really love this Gamay. It's full of these really bright and lifted red fruits. It's quite tart, but in a very attractive way, and it's got a lot of almost Christmas cake type aromas. Do you make the Gamay differently to the way you make Pinot?
Yeah, so we do probably two different winemaking styles with our Gamay. So in 2018, 40% of it was 100% whole bunch done in carbonic maceration. So that basically means you put the whole bunches into a tank, we cover it with CO2, and then we put plastic over the top and cover it up. And then that basically starts fermenting in its own skins. And it ferments slowly over time, and we kind of left it on skins and with the stalks for around about 4 to 5 weeks with a little bit of stomping in between. The other 60% is done where we bring it in from the vineyard and we just stem it, and then it goes whole berry straight into an open vat. And so that 60% is made probably in a little bit more of a similar style to how the Pinot is made. We then basket press it and put it into old oak, and it all goes into old oak separately. And then we, I guess, blend it after about 9 months in old oak and put it into tank for it to blend for about a month. So, yeah, there's two different styles. Both have quite unique, I think, characteristics and flavour profiles, and when you blend them back together, they do complement each other so that you get a little bit more complexity and a bit more layering through the, I guess, the wine. So the Cab Mac done with the stalks and the amount of time that it has on stalks tends to give it a little bit more of that herbaceous, slightly more earthy kind of fruit, flavour profile, whereas the whole berry is a little bit more richer in colour and a little bit more richer in fruit flavours. And so, yeah, when you blend it back, you get a little bit of that earthy herbaceousness, but also some, lovely fruit sort of, really delicate fruit flavours as well.
And where did your ideas for the making of this wine come from?
Lots of drinking, lots of trialing out different types of wines, asking, I guess, people that do make Gamay and love Gamay and have spent some time in Beaujolais. And then we planted the vines in 2013 and our first vintage was 2017. And I guess that was our first time of playing with the winemaking around Gamay. And then at summer, or European summer, so June time in 17, we went over to Beaujolais and spent a bit of time and, I guess did a lot of research, lots of checking out different regions within Bourges and different winemaking styles. And I think for us, it was that real... The wines that had that, I guess, the mixed winemaking where they had a bit of whole berry and a little bit of Cab Mac really were the ones that we enjoyed the most. And so that was, I guess, the style that we went with a bit more in 2018.
Great. Love it. Renata, thank you so much for joining us. We'll crack on now. We'll bring up Natasha Webster, our next guest, and we'll grab you back for some Q&A shortly. So, our final wine for this evening, Empire of Dirt, brand new label by Natasha Webster, based out in Geelong. This is a Gamay, of course. Natasha's going to jump online. We're going to be able to ask her all about it. Tash, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries.
So this is your first release of Empire of Dirt. In the Empire of Dirt range, I believe you're making 3 wines. Why did you decide for Gamay to be one of those 3?
Geelong traditionally sort of known as a a Pinot Noir and Chardonnay region, but we're sort of often finding that the vintages are getting a bit warmer, and with picking Pinot in sort of February sometimes because of the ripening, we're sort of finding the Pinot is sometimes not always shining as well as it should. So yeah, looking towards other varieties. I'd been aware of the Gamay that was out where I get it for a few years, and having tried a few other Gamays from around Victoria, sort of had always wanted to get into it. And I just really enjoy Gamay because it is quite a happy, cheeky drink. So always enjoyed it.
Where in Geelong are you sourcing these grapes from?
So these grapes for the Gamay come from Sutherland's Creek, and it's the oldest Gamay planting in all of Geelong. So it was planted in 1999, 2000, and a lot of the other places around Geelong that have subsequently put Gamay in are mostly from cuttings from this vineyard. So it's the oldest Gamay in Geelong.
Looking at the glass in this wine, it's such a dense wine. I mean, it's very light on the palate, but the fruits are quite darker. It's got this sort of baking spice character to it, but surprisingly, the alcohol's only 12.5%. Is this what's this down to?
I think most of the richness of the fruit comes from the fact it's from the Moorabool Valley, and a lot of the fruit there does just get this really rich, voluptuous character to it. And there's this real depth and generous of the palate for most of the wine. So similar with the Shiraz that I make. It's not overly alcoholic, but does just have that really almost voluptuous character to it because the fruit is just so beautiful and so concentrated. I think most of Moorabool Valley is a bit of a rain shadow. So every year we're struggling with the amount of water that we've got for the vineyards, and therefore the yields can be a little bit lower. But I think for me, it increases the intensity in the fruit, and you're seeing that across a lot of the red varieties in the Moorabool Valley.
Tash, let's jump into some questions from the audience now. We'll get our friends Syd and Renata back on the line. Okay, Syd, first question is for you. What would you say is typical of King Valley Gamay?
Well, for me, it's not as though I've got a huge amount of comparison because, like I mentioned, there's not a whole lot grown elsewhere. But it's you mentioned that little minty thread through it. That's certainly there from all those beautiful eucalypts. And I see a real bay leaf character, which complements a lot of those spicy elements. And then depending on the vintage, you can get. In the warmer years, you get the real depth of fruit going more from the red and blue fruits into the plum spectrum. Yeah.
Renata, how long have you made Gamay for, and was it easy to get it right?
So this is actually going to be my second vintage. Our first vintage out of our young wines was in 2017. So this is my second go. I'd like to think I've got it right. It's looking really good. I think it's much better than our 17 being the first vintage from the young vines. But hey, lots to learn and lots to still explore.
Natasha, what's the hallmark character of Geelong Gamay?
I think it's very bright and juicy. Probably the Gamay that most people have known for years has come from the Farr family, and I think a lot of people probably do aim to sort of get that character. There's just a real almost velvety, generous juiciness to it just the fruit freshness, I think, is just really what comes up in Geelong. Despite the warmer parts that it's mostly grown in, it does seem to just really create that sort of bright just yumminess that everybody can enjoy with a group of friends. So,
Syd, are you looking for structure and depth with your Gamay, or more so something bright and fresh?
Well, yeah, I do. With the straight Gamay that we've tasted today, certainly within reason. I still want it to be drunk young, but it's still potentially, depending on the vintage, sell it up to 5 to 8 years. But the blend I mentioned before, the Pinot Gamay, that's certainly has more tension and is light and a bit more playful. Yeah. So I get to play with a couple of ferments and then blend them into those two different wines.
Natasha, where is the Gamay vineyard situated?
So it's in the Moorabool Valley in Sutherland's Creek, not far from the sort of township of Bannockburn, sort of in a triangle between Bannockburn, Anakie and Maud, I guess. So, yeah, it's in a bit of a valley there, but really nice spot.
Renata, do you think we'll see more Australian Gamay in the more complex cru style with vine age?
Yeah, like I like to say, I think, I guess I'd like to see Gamay expand in Australia. I think it is a variety that is super exciting. It's something that we can definitely grow. It's something that you can have some fun with. So I would definitely like to think that it is something that will develop and create its own style within Australia. So yeah, it's a pretty young variety, I think, here. And, I guess the guys in Sorenberg at Beechworth have been doing it for quite some time, but some of the other plantings are quite new. So, who knows what will happen in the Macedon Ranges, for example. We're looking to plant a little bit more. We're actually going to plant some more different clones as well. I know Geelong's looking at planting loads. So, yeah, who knows? I definitely think it's going to expand and we'll see more of it.
Yeah. I would know that in Australia with Gamay at the moment, I mean, there might be sort of 20 to 30 producers at most making a varietal Gamay. So it is still very much in that rarely seen category. Syd, love your wine, Syd. Is the Gamay the same fruit that goes in the Driftwood Pinot Gamay?
Yes, so two separate picks. The earlier pick always goes into the Driftwood, and that's pretty much exclusively 100% whole bunch now. And the second pick a little bit later, obviously a little bit more richness and higher alcohols. So that goes into, but same vineyard, just a different picking date.
Natasha, I'm really curious as to why there's an octopus on the Empire of Dirt labels.
Okay.
Question mark. I love them. I'm curious as to the backstory.
Okay, well, I've just always been absolutely fascinated by octopuses, octopuses, stories out with which you say, but always been fascinated by them. But then I got a, hang on, not getting my angles right, Inkwork, and loved it. And so when I was coming up with the label, I wanted a street art vibe. So I spoke to a local street artist whose name is Allain, and she's done a lot of art for Little Creatures in Geelong and also Hosier Lane and other places in Melbourne. And so I took it to her and said, start with this and see where you go. And so she's really captured the tattoo that I really love. And then just for her aspect, she wanted the splash paint on there. And I was sort of really happy with that because it kind of looks like wine drips on a tablecloth of red wine. So we kind of banged it out together over a beer and, really happy with it. So that's where it's come from.
Great. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are done with you for now. Syd, Renata, Natasha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Have a good night. And all we need to say now is that we're done for our virtual tasting events from our top 50 winemakers for 2020. What comes next is the announcements of our Young Gun of Wine Awards, and that's happening on Monday in 2 days' time. We're going to be back here. So jump onto our website and keep an eye out for our news around the announcement of the awards. And tune in Monday night, 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And before then, by Monday morning, you need to, if you haven't already done so, jump online and vote. Who is the People's Choice? Who is the #1 winemaker in our Young Gun of Wine Awards? And by helping us decide that trophy winner, you can yourself have the opportunity to win some amazing prizes that we've got on offer. One of which is a Liebherr wine cellar, not this exact model, but a Liebherr cellar nevertheless. Liebherr are the state-of-the-art wine cellars. They look fantastic in your home or workplace or wherever, your man cave perhaps. This is a dual zone one. They've got UV protectant glass. There's a low vibration mechanism in this model to keep the wines cellared in optimum conditions. They've got a charcoal filter to ensure that the air going into the unit is pristine. And when you open in this model, the gorgeous brushed aluminium finish, the shelving inside, which comes out for easy access, is made of beechwood. So they're the creme de la creme. I want one of these myself. We've also got a holiday down at the Mornington Peninsula, staying at Jackalope Hotels, an amazing hotel. And whilst you're down there for a weekend retreat, we'll arrange a private cellar tasting with Mike Elwood of Ocean 8 and Rollo Crinden of Crinden Dump Wines. They're 2 past Young Gun of Wine winners. And last but not least, we also have a year's supply of wine from our top 50 winemakers to give away. So all you need to do, jump online and vote by Monday morning. Who is the People's Choice? And until then, stay tuned for the announcement on Monday night. We're going to find out who of the top 50 winners are going to take home the awards. And one of those awards is the People's Choice. So you need to vote and come back on Monday night, 6 p.m. We'll see you then. Take care.